Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from the Aberdeen Standard Investments Research Institute. My name is Paul Diggle, Senior Economist at Aberdeen Standard and co-host of the podcast along with my colleague Stephanie Kelly. And today we're doing something slightly different. It's just after 11 a.m. in the UK, 6 a.m. in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, the 4th of November. And we are recording our immediate thoughts and takeaways on the US presidential and congressional elections. And as things stand, we don't know for sure whether it's a Trump or a Biden victory. There are still a few key battleground states yet to declare. And nor do we know for sure whether it's a Republican hold or a Democrat flip of the Senate. So we're going to talk about what we do know, what we don't know, what it all means for the economic and market outlook. And maybe we'll also touch on themes and topics that hold whatever the final result is, things like polling error and the extent to which a very polarized electorate influence this outcome. So I'm joined today by Stephanie Kelly, who's our senior political economist, and Jeremy Lawson, who's the chief economist at Aberdeen Standard Investments. And Steph, why don't we just start with what the current state of play and broad outline of the result is as we have it at the moment?
Sure. So it's probably worth saying up front that we have all been up most of the night. So bear with us if we sound a little bit sleepy. And I think, one of the main messages from the results overnight is that, we may have a few more sleepless nights ahead of us. So what we know is Trump has managed to hold on to Florida. So he won in Florida. And that's important. We talked about this on the podcast last week, but Florida is an important state for Trump. Without it, it would have been hard for him to have a path to re-election. With it, it seems like he does have a path to re-election. And I think that's really where the shift has taken place overnight. Now, that being said, it is worth saying that we still have some Midwestern states that need to really kind of final results. It may take some days. Indeed, in Nevada, it could take a week or 2 weeks to get results. So when we look across the map, not just the Midwestern states, obviously there I mentioned Nevada, and also the crucial one that we're keeping an eye on for today is Arizona. And indeed, maybe by the time this podcast comes out, we'll know for sure, but it looks like Biden has won Arizona, which levels the playing field a little bit against Trump's kind of Florida win. So that's where it leaves us. Huge amount of uncertainty. We are expecting results for some of the Midwestern states today, tomorrow, and Friday. But as I mentioned, this can drag on, particularly at the height of the race, not to mention the kind of, I'm sure we'll go into it more, but the legal uncertainty that these really tight races can introduce, particularly in light of President Trump's protestations to late ballot counting. Now, maybe one of the most kind of striking things, and I'll probably pass to Jeremy to talk about the detail in this, is just, Jeremy, how kind of consistently there still seems to be an issue with polling and capturing Trump support.
Yes, so in Florida, if we look at, for example, the 538 forecast vote share for Florida, they were forecasting Biden to end up with a 2.5 percentage point margin over Trump. And it looks like when all's said and done, the reverse is likely to be true. Trump is likely to win the state by around 3 percentage points. So that is so Trump winning was not necessarily a shock, given that the forecast vote share was within a reasonable confidence interval around the polling that existed. But the 3-point victory, would be quite substantial. And so there seem to be particular issues around difficulty of not just polling the views of Cuban Americans, which are very important in Florida, but then also in surveys and polls where you might weight by Hispanic voters, but if Hispanic voters themselves don't vote as a bloc, which they don't, and people from different backgrounds vote differently, then that can make it especially difficult control for those effects. But in contrast, so if we look at Georgia, well, right now, the result certainly isn't settled, but Biden's got a reasonable chance of winning Georgia from where we stand. And if he does, actually the polls will have been very, very close to being spot on there, and similar for Arizona. But then if we move to the Midwest, we see a different pattern again. Ohio is probably a good example because we have a result there. So currently is where the vote count stands. Trump looks like he's on track to win Ohio by 8 percentage points. Whereas in the 538 forecast vote share, it actually had, on the basis of polls, Trump winning by only 0.6 percentage points. That's a really large polling miss. Wisconsin, we don't have a final result. It looks like Biden's more likely to win there, but if he wins, it'll probably be with a vote margin of about 1 percentage point, in contrast to the 8 percentage points that the polls had been implying beforehand. So I still think there is a systematic tendency for polling in the Midwest to underestimate Republican support or Trump support. So at the moment they're synonymous, but it's not just about Trump, I don't think. And in particular, the very sort of key non-college educated white demographic that can be particularly difficult to poll accurately. And so I think a lot of pollsters are going to have to go back to the drawing board after this result, because even if Biden ends up winning the election, it's not because polling was better this time around. It's just going to simply be because Biden's starting point was stronger than Clinton's in 2016. But some of these errors are going to be of similar magnitude, I think.
Yeah, so certainly the post-mortem on the polls is probably only just beginning, and I imagine will be pretty tortuous for a number of weeks to come. But obviously that's been a crucial part in Trump's victory in Florida. I mean, before we talk about the remaining Midwestern states and the sort of paths that lie ahead for the two candidates through those states, maybe let's reflect for a minute or two on where Biden was able to flip the result, namely, it seems, Arizona and Nebraska's 2nd district. And Jeremy, I think it was an important sort of subplot in all this that the Arizona result, which hasn't been confirmed by all networks at the moment, but it was first declared sort of deep in the night by Fox, which you might ordinarily expect to be sort of a partisan network, but their declaration of Arizona for Biden was sort of an aggressive early call, which I think held back some of the sort of positive rhetoric coming from Trump subsequently. Why do we think sort of Fox were going out on a limb there or making that call early?
Each network has a way of trying to calibrate early returns with what is then likely to come with the rest of it. So they have access to much more granular information at a county and at a district level, which they can sort of use to make predictions on the basis of how it compares with previous elections. I think the important point to remember when it comes to Fox is to separate what you might think of as their editorial comment, which can be very partisan, from their political analysis, which I think they take much more seriously. You actually see that Fox does its own polls, and Fox polling was in no way tilted towards Trump through this particular election cycle. And so I think that their election night coverage and the way that they project results. Now, different networks have different thresholds for when they, from when they call a state. People might remember that in 2004, there was a major error after exit polls where early in the night, some networks were calling that election in favor of John Kerry and key states in that election, and then had to walk it back as results came in through the night. And so so for the most part, networks are very, very cautious. They will not call a state until there's a very high degree of confidence. But the Fox effect, I think, just means that their political analysis is quite separate from what you might think of as the ideological bent of its editorial and entertainment content.
Great. So let's maybe talk about some of those other states that are yet to cool and sort of the trends we're observing so far. So maybe we'll start with Wisconsin and Michigan, because these are two states that we think we'll have a result today from. And the early pattern was Trump being sort of well ahead, and then the very large blue shift as the mail-ins have been counted. Steph, it looks like those are really going to go down to the wire, but it strikes me quite how large the shift towards Biden in the late counting mail-ins has been. I mean, it was enormous.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to bear in mind as we go through the next number of hours. I think what you saw overnight was kind of the flip side. So again, mail-in ballots are dealt with differently in different states. We saw in Florida, for example, they're counted in advance. So what it meant was that Biden started off super strong. And then as election day votes were counted, that led to Trump kind of taking over and ultimately winning that state. For the Midwestern states now, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing the opposite kind of trickle through. And I think that's something that we need to kind of keep in mind is, they look quite close as it stands, but there are definitely areas that haven't still kind of announced or are about to announce. And indeed, those mail-in ballots can be counted, for a number of days afterwards. And this is where focus on Pennsylvania is going to be, I think, laser focused, because Trump has already come out and said that he doesn't want ballots that arrive after election day to be counted. This was something that was put off by the Supreme Court in terms of making a final judgment on. So that seems like the most obvious place where this court battle might start. Now, again, the importance of the Pennsylvania court battle and the delay in counting mail-in ballots, or indeed potentially not counting kind of a certain proportion of them, really does depend on what happens today in terms of, as we mentioned, it looks like Arizona is going for Biden and Nebraska 2nd District. If he wins another couple of the Midwesterns that aren't Pennsylvania, then Pennsylvania kind of becomes a non-issue because he can get to 270 without it, because he has Arizona and Nebraska. So it really is like nail-biting stuff. But we're at the stage now where additional votes should tilt blue. The extent to which they tilt blue will depend on the counties, but we know that Democrats said very clearly in advance they wanted to vote in advance more so than Republicans did.
So let's maybe get it into that scenario where Biden doesn't deliver the knockout blow through Wisconsin and Michigan and Nevada, and it is a case of waiting for mail-ins which can continue to arrive after today in Pennsylvania, and that's going to, as you say, Steph, become the increasing focus of potential legal battles. Jeremy, what does the path ahead look like in that sort of path of the scenario tree?
I think a lot depends on precisely how close the count is under those circumstances. So Pennsylvania is a good example. So the Supreme Court effectively gave Pennsylvania a stay of execution, pardon the pun, when it comes to making a decision on precisely which votes can be counted. So Republicans have effectively said anything that was not received by election day should not be counted, whereas obviously Democrats, their preference is to have votes that were postmarked before the election still be able to count afterwards. And so the Supreme Court effectively decided that it would make a judgment on that after the fact. And similar challenges are going to take place in any other state that the result might be quite close in. And so that, I think, is going to be quite crucial, is what decision is made about which votes can be allowed and which votes not allowed, and therefore whether that's enough to leave the result genuinely in dispute. So then you get into some of the more extreme scenarios where you might have a conflict between the legislature and the governor as to exactly what the result was in that state, and then who should represent the state in the electoral college. So those things are, we certainly wouldn't be trying to claim that that was the most likely scenario from here. As Steph said, there are still many paths that mean that Pennsylvania may turn out not to be the tipping point, but that is still an open possibility. And I think what we can be absolutely certain, given the way that Trump is already tweeting and commenting about the election being stolen, is that Republicans will pull out all the legal stops to try and get a more favourable result for themselves.
Yeah, before we maybe move to the Senate results, we probably should note that Trump press conference, or it wasn't quite a press conference, sort of an address very early on Wednesday morning, in which he maybe stopped short of a full declaration of victory, but he very much flirted with the declaration. And Steph, is that a tactic we're likely to see more of over the next few days?
Yeah, I think it seems likely that we're going to continue to see. I mean, it might be slightly underplaying it to say that he stopped short. He kind of said he basically has won the election, which has kind of met with a lot of criticism, even from kind of conservative supporters of his in the past. So people like Chris Christie, for example. So I think that's kind of something that he flagged quite extensively in advance was likely to happen. But obviously, investors going into this will have hoped for a relatively clean result, relatively little ambiguity, but that's the world that we're in. And so I would expect that ambiguity continues in the coming days. Again, as I said, I think it really does depend on what happens with with a couple of the Midwestern states pre-Pennsylvania. But it is, I think, we should be kind of buckling up for potentially quite contentious results, particularly where results are really tight because, and again, rules differ massively by state, but in some cases, automatic recounts can be triggered. In others, depending on the margin or indeed if absent of any kind of margin rules, candidates in their parties can request a recount. And so all of that are things we should definitely have on our horizon, as well as then the legal battle, which has already been extensively signaled by Trump, but maybe investors and maybe political commentary more broadly were hoping that was kind of talk in advance of the election, but wouldn't end up being in this world. But as we said last week, the tighter the election, the more these kind of issues come into focus, and this is certainly a tight election.
So, Steph, maybe let's get into the question of the Senate then. We don't know for sure the Senate result. It may still depend on the presidential result and the VP's role as a tiebreaker. It may still depend on the Georgia special election next year. But what is clear is that it's not the decisive Democratic flip that some polling suggested possible. So what were the key states that did or didn't go change hands?
So this is, the Senate is kind of an interesting one because we have seen the Democrats flip 2 seats so far, but obviously they lost. So in terms of the seats that they picked up was Arizona and Colorado, who they had been well signaled in advance that those were the seats that were likely to go to the Democrats, but then they've lost Alabama, which again was very well kind of documented and expected. So those are that's what we know. I think the challenge we have is that when we looked at the races in advance, there were kind of 4 or 5 places where it looked like Democrats were kind of comfortable. And, a couple of those places, I think, North Carolina is a good example where actually it looks as though the Democrat, I think at time of recording, I think it's been announced that he's lost to the incumbent, Tom Tillis. So again, that's a space where, that's a disappointment. And because the margins were so tight, it is making it much harder. And as you mentioned, I think Georgia really comes into play here. And it's important for people listening to bear in mind that Georgia has 2 seats up for election. One of them is a special election, which will have a runoff in January. So what that means is that we might not know if the Democrats have managed to get to 50 until January. It looks as though the kind of the best they can hope for now is 50, maybe 51, although I struggle to find a place where I can see that coming through really clearly. But it is probably in the Georgia seat and maybe some of the results still to come that could push it that way. But it's certainly looking much more challenging than it did based on kind of pre-election polling, which again, I think in some ways is reinforcing the message about the importance of the president in pushing these kind of election results and that prevalence of voting for a similar candidate for president as for in the Senate. We're seeing that kind of come through in a number of states here, which I think is important, to bear in mind in general, because a lot of money is put into these races, obviously, and a lot of time and a lot of work goes into it. But ultimately, there is a degree to which candidates are tied to the fate of the president. And in a world where Biden's having a much tighter night, that makes it all the tighter for the Democrats, and I think much more challenging to get to that majority.
And Jeremy, the Senate outcome is absolutely critical, isn't it, to the economic and market outcome. So without knowing the Senate result, it may not be completely clear what a Biden or a Trump victory means for the economy. And talk us through why that Senate outcome is so crucial.
Yeah, I think in some ways people focus more on the presidential side of the equation than they do on the congressional side of the equation, and that is a mistake because many of the most important things will determine the economic and market outlook, and the composition of that over the next few years will be determined, within Congress. So let's take fiscal policy as an example. If Democrats can form even a small majority in the Senate, then the option and the possibility of a very large 2-stage stimulus program comes into view, something that could add 15% worth of GDP over the next sort of 3 years in terms of support and stimulus payments, that type of magnitude. And that has really significant implications for the speed of the recovery, aggregate earnings for the, for markets, real tailwind to thinking about, so what are the implications for when the Fed might eventually lift interest rates, inflation, all of those sorts of things. But even if Biden wins and so just with a marginal change in the Senate so that the Republicans retain that majority, if Republicans, as we think is likely, don't play ball when it comes to support and stimulus programs, then you may get no stimulus at all, or at least only a very small amount of additional stimulus. So that can be the difference. That can make a difference of 4 years in terms of the delay to when the Fed might be able to lift interest rates in our projections. It makes a really big difference to the inflation outlook. Some of the popular market trades like curve steepeners, which are sort of anticipating sort of this Democratic clean sweep, well, they become much less attractive in these circumstances because of the weaker economic sort of growth environment and the lower for longer theme being reinforced. But it's not just that. It also relates to what you might think is possible around the regulatory environments. To take climate change, Joe Biden has got a very significant climate agenda, but much of that agenda rested on a desire or on the expectation, hope that they would have a small majority in the Senate. Without that, without the possibility that they could even end the filibuster, then they have to lean more exclusively in that scenario on regulatory powers within existing legislation. And whilst they can be meaningful, they're clearly limiting relative to another scenario. So this sort of matters for this that congressional makeup matters for stimulus. It also matters for what you might think of as domestic regulation, and then that therefore matters a lot for what type of sector rotation you can expect. And so at the moment, you can sort of see markets are reacting to this news, but part of it's other than the uncertainty, it's very difficult to price because all the three scenarios that we've laid out, which have very different macro and micro consequences, are still in play. And so I think we should be looking forward to some pretty big swings in markets over the next 1 to 2 weeks as we sort of wait for greater clarity.
I suppose the one market move that you can pull out that has been fairly clear has been that unwinding of the blue wave trade, right? That was thinking that it was going to be a very decisive Biden victory and clean sweep and then additional stimulus, and that's probably been the dominant market move overnight. Yields down, dollar up, betting markets all over the place, but at one point pricing in a Trump victory.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think that makes sense. To some degree, the blue wave idea was always overestimated, right? So I think, again, even in the 538 projections and our projections, what we were looking at was most likely like 51.49, 52.48. We were never looking at 55, 56. It wasn't feasible. I think people might be conflating blue wave with scale of, magnitude of victory in certain states. But even if it turns out that it's so Biden wins the presidency and Democrats have 50 votes without that in the Senate, that 50+1 can still be a pathway to quite meaningful legislative change. So I don't think we can rule out that aggressive stimulus. I think would be very premature to do that. It's still a possibility, but you're absolutely right, is that markets' assessment of the probability of that has shifted, then clearly sort of market sort of pricing has been evolving with it.
So maybe a final question, I'll ask it first of you, Steph, and then you, Jeremy. It's one thing, the clear thing we do know is that it's a much closer result than many have thought, and no matter if it's Biden or Trump. What does that closeness of the result mean for the longer term state of US politics? I mean, perhaps some people had thought this result would be maybe a repudiation of Trumpist populism. That's clearly not what the result has been. He may well be a force on the electoral scene, on the political scene, one way or the other, whether he is in a second term or not. But what are you thinking, Steph, first, this means longer term for the state of US politics?
I think it probably just reinforces those themes that we talk about as longer term important kind of investment themes, which is around polarized partisan politics. We talk about the role of populism a lot, but I think that we really need to put that in the context of actually much more polarized politics. And in the case of the US, what you can see is divisions among the electorate about all kinds of economic policy views, foreign policy views, human rights views. All of these kinds of issues are really dividing the US electorate. And I think, that's clearly a theme that is not going anywhere fast. And, in some ways, it'll be interesting to see what the overall national vote share ends up looking like. But, Biden went in leading by kind of 8 to 9 percentage points. And indeed, a couple of weeks back, he was leading by 11 percentage points in these averages. Now, obviously, we've talked about it a lot. What that tells us is, polls were clearly overestimating it. But that also what it tells us is actually, now when we look at the reality of the results, it is the case that large numbers of people in the US with very, very different views. And the two-party system means that you end up with these potential for major swings in the way that policy gets done. And to your point, I think, the Trump effect on the Republican Party is unlikely to go away, even if he doesn't end up winning, because this has hardly been a repudiation. It's obviously going to be very tight. And I think that matters a lot for the overall political environment in the US.
Jeremy?
So for me, I think there are some interesting takeaways. I'd just echo what Steph had said. So one is, I think one of the consequences to draw out is you oscillate between, depending on what election results are, between periods of sclerosis, so to speak, right? So particularly legislatively, because if you're in a more partisan environment and you don't have unified government, then it's extremely difficult to get any legislative change in those circumstances. But then in the brief bursts in where you do get unified government, you get a lot of change, increasingly more what you might call more radical change, either pushing left or right. But then from say a market and economist forecasting perspective, a significant potential then to reverse that when fortunes sort of change at the margin. And so from the perspective of the predictability of policy, from the perspective of how confident can you be of, a structural reform agenda that deals with many of the very sort of significant economic challenges the US sort of faces sort of over the next few years and beyond, it's hard to feel very confident about that outlook. So that's one. Another, which I think is interesting, is that, so again, let's assume that the Democrats that Biden does eke out a small victory in the Electoral College, and that actually even the Democrats manage to get to 50 seats in the Senate. The very worst takeaway from them would be to pat themselves on the back, because, think about it. If Trump loses this election by a small amount, even in the midst of a terrible pandemic that most people think that Trump handled poorly, then actually you can make a strong argument in the absence of that, and Democrats might have been trounced in this election, right? And so from that perspective of, if Trump loses, has that ideology been repudiated? Absolutely not. The signal here is that this is a really important part of electoral views. They're here to stay, and both parties have to confront that. The Democrats have to confront their white, non-college educated voter problem, and that is not going away. In fact, this election is reinforcing that problem, even if they end up with a better outcome than 2016.
Jeremy, Steph, thank you so much. You may have been operating on little sleep, but I think we've still got some razor sharp insights there. We will no doubt be back over the next few weeks on the podcast, digesting further what all this means, what a final result, when we have it, means for the economic and market outlook. But until next time, thank you for listening and good luck out there.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein. and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.